funded by Western Michigan University's Ethics Center. So as I'm sure you would agree, we need a peace lecture in the world we live in. So again, thank you so much for coming. I'm Sandy Board, the director of the Ethics Center. Our mission is to create interdisciplinary opportunities for the university and community to engage in public reflection about ethical issues. And so I'm really glad again to see you today. I know some of your students and may need to track your attendance. I think there's a sign-in sheet going around. There's also a QR code at the table out front. So either way, you can track your attendance that way. There's also some flyers on the table outside. So if you want to know what else we're up to, please check us out. We actually have another event coming up on November 3. This is a virtual event that's part of the Midwest Medical Humanities Conference on November 3. It's about AI. Isn't everything about AI these days? It's called Chatbots in Medicine, Helpful Nudge or Biased Manipulation. And it's going to be at 12 p.m. on Teams. So you do need to get the link for that. If you take our flyer from the table, there's a QR code that'll send you to the conference website, and the link will be posted there closer to the event. And everybody is welcome to attend. It's open to the public. And the speaker is Dr. Matthew DeCamp. He's from the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado Antut's medical campus. So again, this is the AI, especially the intersection of medicine. That may be a talk for you. And we also have one last book club that's starting soon. You can still register. We have the flyers out front for that as well. Funding for today's events was provided by the Ethics Center's Winnie Veenstra Endowment for Peace Lectures, which was established by an alumna of Western Michigan University in 1986. Don't want to forget to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, the Haneke Institute for Global Education, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Spanish, the WMU Native American Affairs Council, and the Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, otherwise known as NO. And I also wanted to acknowledge that Western Michigan is located on lands historically occupied by Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations of the Three Fires Confederacy. And in fact, I think you'll be touching on some themes having to do with Indigenous peoples in your lecture, yes? So wonderful, so thank you. So I'm very pleased. We had to reschedule this one, so it's like, I feel like I've been waiting for you forever, Edgar. But this is Edgar Franco-Vivanco, and he's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Michigan. His work explores the diverse ways in which indigenous populations resisted and assimilated to colonial rule, as well as the long-term legacies of colonialism in Latin America. He also investigates how contemporary criminal and political violence impacts communities, especially in Brazil and Mexico. His research has been recognized with the 2021 Heinz Elo Award for the Best Paper, published in the American Political Science Review, and the 2022 Mary Parker Follett Award for the Best Paper, published in Politics and History. Dr. Franco-Vivanco is the co-founder of the Historical Institutions Lab at the University of Michigan and holds a PhD in political science from Stanford University. Now, for the 2023 Winnie Veenstra Peace Lecture, it's titled Between Violence and Resistance, the Challenges of Latin America in the 21st Century. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandy. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and to everybody involved in organizing this event. And I'm particularly excited to be here today talking about Latin America because I think that unfortunately it's a region of the world that, despite being a crucial partner and neighbor to the US, it's really disregarded somehow both in the media and sometimes in the academia. And I think this is something that we need to be talking more about Latin America. We really want to understand the US. I mean, like, if we think about the region, we need to think about Latin America as a crucial partner to the US in terms of, in economic terms, for example. Two economies of the US and many countries in the region are deeply connected. Mexico, for example, is the second trading partner to the US, and obviously there are many socially speaking, there are millions of people Latin America and some Latin descent that live in the US, and if we think about some of the cities in the US, we travel to some places in LA or Miami, those are in some sense Latin American cities where a lot of people speak Spanish. There is some Latin American culture happening, being produced there. So it's actually interesting that we cannot think about these two regions separately. There's of course some dark side of this story. If we also take a look to the past, the 20th century, we can see how the US interventionism has played a really important role in shaping some of the autocratic regimes in the region. And today, this is something that I'm going to be talking about, how the relationship, this connection between trading of drugs and weapons between these two countries is fueling violence in the region and in the US, of course. Today, I'm going to talk about these challenges, some challenges that I think are crucial in Latin America, challenges that the region is experiencing right now. But of course, this is a really broad topic, so I'm not going to try to give you a final solution or a final idea or a central solution to many of these challenges, but I think at least I want to give you a broad perspective of what's happening in Latin America, and hopefully to provide a little bit of a path to the ways I think we can try to solve some of these really complex challenges. But let me just start recognizing that Latin America is experiencing really hard times today. I think we are seeing really hard times in the region. And in fact, what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this lecture is that if I was going to give this talk 10 years ago, the tone of my lecture will be very different. Around 2010, poverty was decreasing in the region, and even inequality, which is one of the most pressing problems in Latin America. Even though it was still really high, there were some interesting ways in which governments were addressing this issue. For example, through conditional cash transfer programs that were somehow successful. There are very prominent examples like Mexico had Oportunidades, Brazil Bolsa Familia. Also, if we take a look, for example, to the trend that the region was having in terms of democratic regimes, of democratization, we can see how many countries are actually becoming in somehow democratic. And this is also really relevant, thinking about the autocratic past of the region. So we see this is one of the many ways in which we can measure how the level of democracy in one country, and here, at least with this score, the Polity 4 score, we see that by 2010, many countries in Latin America were becoming more and more democratic, and some in the autocracies that were dominating the region were actually decreasing. Now, today, 2023, things are, I think, very, very different. If we take a look to some of the same measures about democratization, today we're experiencing a democratic backsliding, and this democratic backsliding is more prevalent in Latin America than any other region in the world. Perhaps 10 years ago, there were we could talk about these two isolated cases of autocracies, Venezuela and Cuba. But today, we can see that many countries have joined these ranks. For example, Nicaragua is with the regime of Daniel Ortega is becoming now, I think, autocracy that is repressing many of the people who's opposing the regime, using violence against them. We can also take a look at El Salvador, where Nayib Bukele, this young president who talks as himself as I'm literally quoting him, the world's coolest dictator. He's using mass imprisonment. He's diminishing many of the institutions that were created in this country for a long time and took a lot of effort to build. So here we see in these pictures, I think key things that the president himself has posted on how to control this really important problem that is gun violence that has been really present in El Salvador. He's also some violent measures and diminishing, as I said, human rights. And although it seems to at least decrease violence in some sense, seems to be really a short-term solution. But as we see, this is something that now is happening all around the continent. How democratic regimes that we thought they were very strong, that they were at least putting some roots 10 years ago, after this long history of authoritarian regimes that Latin America suffered for almost all the 20th century. Now we are seeing how many countries are going back to supporting autocracies, to diminishing check and balances, and to from the size of society, actually, there's a lot of increasing support for authoritarian regimes. Something like this democratic backsliding was really, I think, one of the main prominent examples in which we can see this decreasing in democracies, what is happening in Brazil, or at least what happened for sure at the beginning of this year. We see this, I think, tropical replica of the Capitol riot, but in Brasilia, in which supporters of the former president Jair Bolsonaro stormed the Brazilian Congress and used many similar ways in which to try to seize power in a way that was really similar to what happened in the US. And again, this is something that I can give you examples about many, almost every single country. For example, Peru, a country that was also having some improvements in democracy at some point, has had 6 presidents in the past 6 years, many of them accused for corruption, impeached by Congress for different criminal charges, and this is something that is affecting democracy in the region. Another problem or great challenge that I see, that I think Latin Americans experience today, is criminal violence. And this is a picture of Fernando Villavicencio, who was the presidential candidate in Ecuador, who was shot dead recently at a rally, at a campaign rally that he was having. He was prominent, has been speaking against the criminalization of Ecuadorian politics. He has been receiving threats by some Mexican cartels that have been entrenching in this country, and sadly he was killed, probably because many of these criminal organizations thought he was going to probably threaten their power, the increasing power he was having. But to give a little bit of context of what is criminal violence and what it means to this region, we have to also take a look of what this means. And by criminal violence, what we need to understand is that although for obvious reasons, violence that happens because of war, international war, or civil war is something that we see in the news, that it's something that it's everywhere, obviously, and I don't want to diminish this because it's crucial, it's really important, but also it's important to understand that most of the violence, the people who die today of a violent death in the world is not happening, that those deaths are not happening in places with conflict, are actually happening in places that are not officially in a war. Places that, most of them, democratic places, but these deaths occur for criminal violence. So if we see some of this data here, it tells that around 74%, this is from a couple of years ago, but I don't think numbers have changed that much, around 74% of intentional, of violent deaths in the world happen because intentional homicides, compared to only around 14% of deaths that happen in a violent setting, such as a civil war or an international war. So there's a problem of criminal violence that is a humanitarian challenge and a security challenge that somehow has misrepresented in, I think, again, in something that we see at least in the media. And again, I don't want to diminish the deaths that happen in war settings, but it's important to understand that when we talk about violence and we want to understand and control violence, we need to talk about this kind of violence as well, which is today the most prevalent kind of violence in the world. And this is also the violence that is affecting mostly Latin America. Although Latin America has only 8% of the world's population, it also has 38% of homicides that happen in this region. So it's a region that has an important bias, and it's in terms of the violence that is experienced here in terms of criminal violence. 43% of the 50 more violent cities in the world are also in Latin America. And today, cartels, drug trafficking organizations control many of the different territories in Latin America. They control parts of, or they are really connected with parts of the government and the military. So this is another challenge that Latin America is experiencing today. And also, I think that it cannot be understood with a lot of understanding this backsliding in democracy, of how people has now mistrust or has trusting less that democracies can deliver what I guess they thought it was promised to them, at least in terms of peace. Violence is affecting different populations in Latin America also in different ways. There's, of course, bias towards criminal violence affecting the poor and people who has less access to some private resources to protect themselves, but also it's affecting some crucial aspects of these countries. For example, public journalism. So last year, Latin America was the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist outside Ukraine. So according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there were about 67 killings in the world of journalists, and nearly half of them occurred in Latin America. And I think it's important to put attention to this kind of violence, because these people, these journalists, were actually targeted. They were killed because they were doing what they thought it was their responsibility and their job, to inform the public about what was happening in their own cities, in their own towns. And because of what they said, because of what they wanted the people to know. They were killed. I mean, many occasions they were, yes, targeting these criminal cartels, but in some occasions they were also talking about the relationship between governments, local governments, and sometimes federal governments with criminal organizations. And also, this tells us something about how in Latin America we cannot think about criminal organizations and the government just as separate entities. We need to think about them as these two connected bodies which they interact with each other in very complex and different ways, which of course have very dire outcomes, such as the killing of dozens of people, including journalists, including also people who is defending the environment. Last year, about 200 people in the world were killed for defending the environment, for organizing, for bringing some of these issues of extraction to attention of the public. About 50 of them happened in the Amazon forest, and again we see here again how Latin America has a disproportionate number of people who is being killed for defending, in this case, the environment. Again, how violence is affecting Latin America in a very disproportionate way. And within Latin America, it's affecting people in very disproportionate ways. So it's affecting mostly the poor, it's affecting people who is talking about these issues, people who's organizing against extraction, and among them, indigenous communities are also particularly being targeted. About some, within these killings of environmental activists, around 34% were killings of indigenous people. And here, it's where we can see then this connection between violence, defense of the environment, and also this how both violence and the fact that the state is not defending many of these people is also affecting population in a disproportionate way. And here I think is the moment where I would like to pivot my talk to my own research, which is really focused on indigenous populations. And I really like this map because although when we think about indigenous people in the world, we all, although think about something from colonial times or a really small population. Although it's true that, depending how you measure, obviously this changes a lot. But let's say the estimates that about 5% of the world population is considered indigenous. However, if we map where this population lives, we can see here that about a quarter of the world is managed by indigenous people. And crucially, many of these areas that are managed by indigenous people are areas that are intact ecological landscapes. So, indigenous populations are crucial to both defend the environment and also to defend the encroachment of some extractive companies, extractive organizations, extractive institutions that are affecting particular areas of the environment. And here, just to give you at least some positive news, some positive examples that have happened in the past couple of months, we can see that indigenous people have been mobilizing a lot to defend these lands where they have lived for hundreds of years, if not thousands. For example, in Brazil, recently the Supreme Court ruled to preserve indigenous lands, removing some imminent threat to those protections, something that happened a couple of months ago. And in Ecuador, the population vote to stop some drilling practice, some drilling industry that was happening in a particular region called the Yasuni, which is not only a very rich region in terms of in ecological terms, but it's also a crucial region where some of the indigenous population, indigenous tribes that are voluntarily have kept out of the state and out of the Western society in a voluntary way are still living. So we can see here, and I wanted to put these examples just to give you some positive news about telling you all these bad stories from Latin America and the dark times where I think we are living, but to also understand how it's crucial to understand this, how indigenous population has been mobilizing and how Earth have been mobilizing for hundreds of years. And just to give you a bit of historical context to who these indigenous populations are and the level of extraction they have suffered, this is a graph in which we can see the population collapse that in central Mexico happened after the Spanish conquest. And this was due to a series of epidemics, a series of violence that happened to this population. But I think what is the central point here that I want to bring attention to is to see how the population reduced from 22 million in the estimates to less than 1 million. And this small population has actually been crucial to understand Latin America and to confront the state in many different ways. Historically, these populations have been creating art, this is an example of the Florence and Codex, which is one of the first ways in which indigenous populations start to use art to tell their stories in their own way, and how they use some of the tools that the Europeans were giving them, they were actually wanted to implement on them, to actually reappropriate them and to tell their own story. And something that has happened, that happened a lot using maps, and we can see examples of beautiful crafted maps that indigenous population started to create very early on to define where their lands were and where their lands started, where are the people who are around them, usually the local elites, wanted to extract some of these lands, and they used these maps to defend these lands using in some ways the tools of the empire, because these maps were sent to the Spanish courts in which they engaged in usually some legal conflict to actually try to defend these lands, and in many cases they were successful. This is something that we can also see in thousands and thousands of petitions that were sent during the 16th century, 17th century, and 19th century, and really something that keeps happening today, how indigenous communities also learn how to use the legal system very skillfully, and how to use these types of petitions that are, when we start reading them, they are like a legal petition that was crafted to send to the central courts, both in Mexico City or Lima, or even to Madrid, in Latin America, to at least in this region of the Americas, to defend what they thought or they knew that it was theirs, and to defend from abuses from local elites or corruption from local bureaucrats. And here, the point that I want to make is to how indigenous populations have learned how to use different techniques, different strategies to defend their communal lands and their culture through many different centuries. And this is something, these particular petitions are a central part of my own research. I won't go through details right now, maybe we can talk about this more. And this is something that, at least in the social sciences, we have ignored in this central theme of indigenous agency during colonial times, and even today is something that has not been studied. And again, coming back to the 21st century and why this matters, I want to just show you this graph in which we can see how, if we differentiate the towns that had this history of communal engagement, of that towns that have contested the colonial empire, then the nation state, versus and towns that have been, in short, considered indigenous in many different ways, or using these types of institutions, versus very similar towns that are maybe similar size or different, similar size and similar populations, at least in terms of socioeconomic terms, but they don't have this specific history. We can see how these towns that are have this colonial and indigenous past are better off of defending their lands, at least here in terms of deforestation. So these are areas in which somehow the communal management they have created have led them to decrease the level of, at least in this case, deforestation, which is something that we have data for, compared to similar towns in which the tree coverage has been actually much more higher. And this is something I think crucial now that when we see Latin America having a boom in the use or the discovery of a lot of commodities that are going to be crucial in the 21st century. It has been a lot of talk about how Latin America is particularly rich in, for example, lithium in Chile. Also, there's silver producing in Mexico that is fundamental to produce solar panels, for example, and also many other countries in the world, in the region, that have these particular commodities that are going to be central to understand or to do the green transition to a net zero emission world. But although this is a lot of promise for the region, I think it also has very important risks, because most of the history about this extraction is a history in which we see a small number of people profiting from these particular industries, and also the environment, and particularly the environment that surrounding indigenous communities being particularly affected. So I think that using or thinking a little bit about out of the box of how we can actually incorporate these commodities into Latin American communities while protecting the environment will be also, it's a conversation that needs to include indigenous populations as well, because as we saw, they have been in a way better off are managing their environment because there are many different theories and reasons, but at least the use of communal lands, the use of or communal institutions, communal lands, is something that they seem to be a crucial population in the world that needs to be incorporated in this conversation if we want to do this right. But I also think that the civil society cannot do this alone. It's indigenous populations, indigenous groups can just not be led to solve this problem. And here is another way in which I think we need to, if not think about out of the box, at least to start doing things a little bit different. And I talk a lot about how criminal violence is affecting Latin America in many different ways, and how some of the regions have been dealing with this problem for decades now. So we see mass imprisonment, so we see the militarization of the police and the creation of military forces in many different countries. But the reality is that violence keeps increasing. So there was an interesting paper that came, I think, the beginning of this month in Science, which incorporates a different solution, which is, well, let's reduce the recruitment or the supply that these cartels would have. And although it sounds like a very logical solution, is something that definitely governments around Latin America have not been implementing, at least seriously. And it's interesting to see in this simulation that this paper did in creating some models with different assumptions that, yes, if we double imprisonment or we increase the militarization of the police, maybe the number of people or the violence due to cartel violence would be decreased. But this is only as a solution that it's I think temporarily and also could backfire, as we have seen. But if we have also a different solution in which just the recruitment of these cartels is just cut, either half or completely, this is where we could possibly start to see some actually diminishing of the violence. And obviously this means to think about long-term solutions of investment in education, investment in job opportunities, and again, something that needs a different vision from what governments are doing now, and also to a lot of convincing to the civil society that the implementation of these iron fist policies that are so popular in the region and have been implemented for many, many decades just are not working still, but it's time to really think about different solutions, like just cutting cartel recruitment, at least in different proportion. So I think I wanted to finish this this lecture giving you some positive notes for Latin America, how I think that incorporating indigenous populations into the conversation of protecting the environment is crucial, and this means, of course, to understand how these populations work while preserving their own traditional ways of governing themselves. And this other way to, thinking that both militarization and iron fist policies have been just backfiring for many decades now, just really increasing and fueling violence, and we need to think in a different way. And just to really finish, I think this is just a part of Latin America. Really, in other ways, and something that gives me a lot of hope, is how Latin America is also thriving culturally. And I just wanted to finish the lecture talking about some of these cultural successes of Latin America. How, if we did see I think this was in the middle of the year, how most of the top 5 songs streamed in the world were in Spanish. And these include, of course, like these superstars, Latin American superstars like Bad Bunny, who I think some of you have heard or know about. But also we can start to see some different and very interesting trends. For example, I like a lot this story of the Lenin Tamayo, who is also portrayed here, who is so he's an indigenous Quechua speaker from Peru who is singing K-pop style songs that are in Quechua. in this indigenous language from the Andean region, and also trying to incorporate some style, and also actually creating this new trend of what is called the Q-pop, which is similar to K-pop, but in Quechua. Just to talk about, I can talk a lot about many different authors that I'm enjoying right now, some books that I have in my that I have in my desk right now that I'm reading. Some authors that are creating different styles in narrative. For example, this Chilean author Benjamin Labatut, this Mexican novelist Fernanda Melchor, who has a very interesting narrative about criminal violence in Mexico, or movies like Alejandro González Iñárritu's Bardo. But I can keep talking about this, but really what I wanted to give to the end of for this lecture, more than recommendation, just to, yeah, I mean, you want to take the recommendations, be my guest for sure, but to at least give you some hope for what I think Latin America is thriving culturally, and I think the civil society in Latin America is something that we need, or it's something that it's only needed, but it's also something that I think we can put a lot of trust in. And I hope that is something that we'll see through the rest of the, or at least the next couple of decades, and see how culturally different ways in how Latin American people is communicating and disseminating their culture, and also defending their territories. It's also that I hope we can see happening. And with that, thank you so much.